Welcome back to another serious Bible Study for All lesson. This lesson is a continuation of a lesson started in a previous video where we began considering the question, why is there evil and suffering in the world? We made the point in the introduction of that video that any answers we give in that video and in this video to that question will probably fail to fully satisfy most of us. And that's partially because the struggle with this question is not just a mental and logical one, it's an emotional one. Evil and suffering affect us on an emotional level, and so often we're looking for emotional answers, and those are often hard to come by. So we will attempt to give logical reasons and maybe even a handful of emotional reasons to answer this question, but we understand that our answers may not fully satisfy you or us, and that they're not intended to pretend or act as if your suffering is not significant, or your suffering is not real. And we hope that that does not come across in our video. But before we get to the lesson itself, I want us to remind ourselves how we're defining these terms of evil and suffering. And so by the word evil, we mean a moral wrong committed by a person or individual who has the ability to choose to do right or wrong. And the first video focused on that question. How could a good, all-powerful God allow evil to exist in the world? In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on the other half. Why is there suffering? And in particular, why is there suffering that's caused by natural disaster? Ultimately, if suffering is caused by an act of evil, the answers from the previous lesson could be used to explain why that might exist in the world. This lesson tackles the more difficult question, in my opinion. Why would a good God, how could a good God allow for natural disasters to cause pain and suffering in the way that we see in the world? Whether you're talking about hurricanes destroying cities or earthquakes, or whether you're talking about diseases or starvation, these naturally caused issues that don't seem to be caused by people or by a person who is committing these acts leading to this pain and suffering. How could God allow that kind of suffering? Why would a God allow that kind of suffering? Before getting to those answers, I want us to review what we call the Trilemma, the three statements that seem to not be able to coexist. And so in this video, again, our focus is on the suffering. So the first thing is that God is all-powerful, or in other words, he is able to end all the suffering that exists in the world. He's able to end all of the earthquakes. He's able to end all of the starvation. He has that power. The second statement is God is all good, and thus a good God should and would end all of the suffering that we see in the world. And yet, here's our conundrum, suffering still exists in the world. And so ultimately the problem comes down to this idea. An all-powerful and good God would end all of the suffering that we see. Thus, many people conclude that either God is not good because he's not ending the suffering. Some people suggest he doesn't even care about the suffering. Or maybe he does care, maybe he wishes he could do something, but he's not all-powerful. He is not able to take care of all of the problems, or, and many people come to this conclusion, he must not exist. And in fact, if someone is going to say that God is not all-powerful and not good, he definitely does not meet the criteria described for God in the Bible. And that being would not really fit what we think of usually when we think of God, and we use the term God. A being that isn't all good and isn't all powerful doesn't really fit what we mean by that phrase. And so like the last video, we asked the question, are we assuming too much in our statements? So we're going to take them one by one and ask that question, are we assuming too much? The reason we asked that question, and we made the point that many people say, well, God can do anything. Thus, he is all-powerful. If we're going to say God is all-powerful, then there's nothing he cannot do. And the Bible does support this idea. The Bible does teach God is all-powerful. Jeremiah 32, verse 17, Ah, Lord God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too difficult for you. Plain as the day. Right there, it says nothing is too difficult for you. God, in response to Jeremiah's statement, actually responds in the same chapter. Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? Very plain, claiming that God basically is all powerful. There's nothing too difficult for him. So clearly this is a problem. However, we did make the point in the last lesson that we have to be more particular, more precise in what we mean by anything. Because if God can literally do anything without any kind of reservation or qualification to that, well then sure, God can be all good and all powerful and choose not to do anything about the suffering. In fact, the very conundrum, the very problem, is that we don't believe God can do anything he wants. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an issue for us on a mental or an emotional level to say, sure, there's suffering in the world, and the good, all-powerful God doesn't do anything about it. But that's actually not even what the Bible means when it says God can do everything. And we made this point in the last lesson too, but Titus chapter 1, verse 2, in this opening letter to Titus, Paul makes his point that God cannot lie. And the reason Titus can put his faith in God's promises is because God has to tell the truth. He's unable to not tell the truth. And that's really great for us because that means we can bank on what God says. One of the major answers to our question of evil in the first lesson was that God can't stop all the evil choices people would make and let free will and love continue to exist. Love must be a choice, and so God has to let us either to choose to love or not love, and he can't stop all the people making unloving choices and let love be a real thing. However, this video is focusing not on the aspect of evil, but on the aspect of suffering. And in that case, based on what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 32, it does seem truthful that God could remove the suffering caused by natural disasters and other causes. That does seem to be within God's power, and I don't know of any philosophical issue or paradox that would be created by saying God could do that. So that comes back to our question, why would he allow that to exist? Why do we see so much in the world today? We will seek to answer that question in a few moments. But let's look at that second line, God is all good. So, is God all good? The Bible is very clear in claiming that about God. One of many passages we could turn to make that point. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Very plain statement that is saying God's good, God's light, there is no darkness, there is no evil, period. So how could a good God then allow suffering to exist? This one we may be assuming a little bit too much in our conundrum, saying a good God wouldn't allow suffering. Would a good God remove all suffering? It's a question we need to ask. Let's consider some physical examples. For instance, you consider exercise, or you consider learning to discipline and be in control of yourself, or you consider learning to think and reason. All of those endeavors require struggle. All of those endeavors require some amount of pain or suffering. For instance, when we go through the process of exercise because we know it's good for our bodies, and I know it makes us stronger, there's some suffering that goes along with that. I mean, because of that reality, there's a proverb that has popped up in our culture that says, no pain, no gain. That without the suffering, we know we don't get the positive result of becoming physically stronger and physically better in shape, and that then helps our body just stay healthier in general. We realize that through this process of exercise that includes some suffering, there's some positive. You could also consider medical procedures that involve some pain and suffering so that we might overcome an illness or overcome a disease, or discipline in training ourselves to be self-controlled, or discipline from an authority figure teaching us what is right and wrong, or even growing an ability to think. Anyone who's ever done any rigorous kind of reasoning, whether that be mathematical proof making, whether that be a philosophy class, or just some field of study, thinking is hard. Thinking is painful. And yet, without going through the process, we don't grow. Now, all of those examples have to do with physical things, and we're really focused on the spiritual things. So, is there any benefit to suffering from a spiritual standpoint? Would a good God remove all suffering? Is that just an obviously true statement? Well, there's actually a pretty close parallel, at least in James chapter 1, between something James says. In fact, in James chapter 1, verse 2, James says something very strange. He says, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter or endure various trials." Now that sounds really weird, because James almost sounds like he's telling us to be masochistic, to like pain. And that's something that we look at. When someone likes to feel pain, we think something is wrong and they need help to better see, more accurately see the world around them, to see it in the right way. But if you look at the rest of what James says in that chapter, look at verses 3 and 4 with me. "Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." The reason James says consider it all joy, and I would suggest joy and happiness are not identical, that I may not be happy about the pain of suffering, just like I'm not happy exercise causes me pain, but I do maintain joy about my life, maintain joy in my situation. He says, look, consider it all joy when you encounter trials, because this testing of your faith produces endurance, and that endurance lets you become perfect and complete. In other words, we're talking about spiritual exercise here, that you cannot come to have faith, you cannot come to have trust without having to be put into a situation where something is hard. If everything in your life was perfect to mostly okay, then you wouldn't have any situation where you would become stressed and concerned and thus would have to exert any kind of faith or trust. There's a similar point made in Deuteronomy chapter 8. In that text, Moses is talking to the people of Israel before he sends them into the promised land. He's not going to get to go. We won't talk about why that is in this lesson. But he's telling them God did let them go hungry at times. Intentionally let them go hungry. And we can say, well, how is that fair? How is that not just cruel of God? But look at chapter 8, verse 3 in Deuteronomy. "He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of God." In other words, he let Israel be hungry so they would learn that true life doesn't come from the bread they eat. True life doesn't come from the physical possessions they have. True life comes from God, that they would learn to trust and depend on God. That their suffering here was intended to teach them to realize where true life came from and where their hope and trust should be in God himself. One more example, talking about Jesus this time. In Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 through 10, the text says, "Although he was a son," talking about Jesus, "he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." In other words, Jesus learned to be obedient by doing things that were not going to be enjoyable and were not going to be easy. If you always obeyed your parents just in the ways you wanted to, well, that's not obedience. If you only do the things that you were already going to do, you're not really obeying them. You're just living out your own will. You can only learn obedience by doing something that you don't really want to do. You can only learn full obedience by submitting yourself to the will of another person. But if you didn't want to do it, then that, to some degree, is suffering. It is a trial of some sort. And maybe it's small or slight, depending on the situation we're considering. But it is still an amount of suffering. However, those things might seem a little small. Those things might seem not a big deal. And we could consider one more, if you consider Romans chapter 5, verse 3 through 5, that we're considering ourselves in this. It says, and not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, hope, and hope does not disappoint. Similar to James's point, but here Paul is making a slightly different point. Is look, we exult in the tribulation not because we like the suffering and pain, but it causes us to learn how to endure. It causes perseverance, and that perseverance develops proven character. In other words, this is a light bulb moment for me. The only way to know who I really am is to face trials and sufferings. If my life is always easy, if I always get what I want, then I'm not going to really know what kind of person, what kind of metal I'm made of until I'm put into a trying situation. And Paul says, look, tribulation creates perseverance, and that perseverance proves to you the kind of character you have, or proves to you that you don't have the character you thought you did. And that allows us to have hope. When we begin seeing ourselves for who we really are, and seeing the change God can make in us, that can give us hope. But as I was saying earlier, all of these may seem to be small compared to what we might call the serious suffering, the big suffering. Okay, maybe there's some room for a good God to allow some kinds of trials, some kinds of suffering and pain. But what about the really, really big stuff? And we won't bother to take the time and ask, well, what do we mean by the big stuff? I will assume you have something in mind, and I think that we will cover it in this lesson. So let's look at a case study of what I think encapsulates serious suffering. So I'll give a quick summary of the story of Job. In Job, chapters 1 and 2, we get what you might call the main events, and then most of the book is a conversation written poetic form between Job and his three friends. But in the first two chapters, Satan shows up in God's throne room, and God asks him, where have you come from? And he says, well, I've come from roaming about to and fro on the earth. And then God says, well, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one righteous like him in all the earth. And you can almost picture Satan's face falling when he says, well, he only serves you because you give him all his stuff and you protect him from all the suffering that's out there in the world. It says, if you took away his stuff and took away everything he had, then he would curse you to your face. And God basically says, give it your best shot. And so in a single day, Satan, unbeknownst to Job doesn't have any idea this is Satan who's actually doing this. When you read the conversation between Job and his three friends, Satan is never discussed. It's almost like they have no picture of Satan acting in the world. They talk about God and they talk about Job, but they don't talk about Satan. And yet Satan takes his 10 children, takes all of his wealth, which at that day and time was measured in the amount of cattle and the amount of donkeys or camels or the amount of livestock you had. It doesn't seem they had a common accepted exchange currency like we do in our cultures today. He loses all of his wealth, and he's a very wealthy man. He also loses his reputation because in this day and age, only bad things happen to bad people. At least that's what a lot of people think. And what's interesting about all of this is that Job suffers because he is good. God says, have you considered how righteous Job is? No one is righteous like Job. And that's what gets Satan so angry and makes Satan want to take all of Job's stuff. And if you're wanting to know how much this affects Job, in chapter 3, the whole chapter is basically Job mourning the fact that he was born, wishing that he had never existed so he wouldn't have to have gone through all of this. In addition to the first chapter, second chapter, Satan actually also takes his health, and he gets his wife to turn on him and say, why don't you just curse God and die? And so the rest of the book then becomes his friends saying, what terrible thing did you do, Job? Like, God would not allow this to happen to you unless you would have just done something awful. And Job's response is, I didn't do anything to deserve this. I cannot think of anything that would make God react this way against me. And after multiple chapters of this conversation basically being played on repeat over and over and over again, with friends basically saying, Job, you had to do something terrible, and Job saying, no, I didn't, Job eventually gets fed up and says, you know what? I'm tired of you guys. I want a court date with God. I want to bring my case to God, and I will prove my innocence. He says, I will show God that I don't deserve to be treated this way. I will show God that I don't deserve to endure this kind of suffering. And remember, this isn't just, oh, he broke a leg. This is, no, he lost his kids and he lost all of his wealth. And he's lost his reputation because everyone thinks Job must have been a terrible person for God to allow this to happen to him. He's lost everything other than his life. That's the only thing he still has, is the fact that he is alive. Well, we may feel like this sometimes in our life. We may want to bring our court case against God and say, look, you have treated me unfairly and unjustly, and you need to fix this. Well, God usually doesn't give us a opportunity to talk to him face to face, but in Job's case, he obliges. In chapters 38 through 41, God is talking to Job. I want you to go to Job 38 if you have a Bible with you. In Job 38 is the opening statement God makes. And I think there's some important details to notice in this opening statement in Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? Or what were its bases, or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. We'll pause right there. God opens up by saying, okay, I'm going to ask you questions and you explain it to me. You tell me the answers to these questions. And then he starts asking Job questions about where was he when God created the world and the universe. Tell me how this happened. Tell me how I did this. Explain this to me, Job. And what's so strange about that, about this ultimate verdict that we're going to see by the end of Job, is that these questions, where were you when I made the universe, are all questions about physical creation. And that is strange because when you read the rest of Job, they don't really talk about physical creation. They're not talking about animals or seasons or the way the physical world works. They're talking about spiritual concepts. Righteousness and justice and sin and punishment for wrongdoing. Why in the world would God begin to talk about physical creation or start asking Job about how the physical world works and how animals eat and how they give birth? What is the point of all of these questions? Well, the point seems to be, Job, you don't fully understand. And you cannot fully control. Chapter 41, that point is made vividly clear. God talks about some awesome creature he's made that he calls Leviathan. And he says, will this creature submit to you? Will it obey your commandments? And he says, if you can't fully understand the physical universe, if you can't fully control the physical universe, why would you expect the spiritual universe to be any different? If you can't understand the things you can see and you can touch and you can hear, why would you expect to fully be able to comprehend the things that you can't see, touch, and hear? Those spiritual concepts of what is fair and just and right and true in every situation. Why do you think with your mental capabilities you'll be able to know exactly what should or should not happen? That is a humbling question. It's a humbling point. It's also not a very satisfying point for a lot of us because we want to understand. We want to know. And sometimes we can almost feel it's unjust for God to not tell us. But before we jump to rash accusations against God, consider these two analogies. All of us were kids at some point. What would you think about the kid that looks at you and says, I will not listen to you, I will not obey you and do what you say unless you can explain to me exactly why I need to do it and why it matters? Imagine a 3-year-old telling you that, or a 10-year-old, or even a 16-year-old. Is it really possible to explain to the 2-year-old and 3-year-old that they fully grasp that you can't play in the road because you're going to die? It's usually around age 4, 5, 6 that death suddenly becomes a reality to kids. And they have this moment where they have to wrestle with the realization, I'm going to die one day. And that's hard for a lot of kids. Age 2 and 3, that really isn't a reality in their mind yet. So even if the parent wants to explain it, the child does not have the mental capability to comprehend the answer. Or imagine a student looking at a teacher saying, unless you can explain something to me in a single go, you get one chance to explain this concept, and if you don't, then you are a failure as a teacher, and I'm never coming back to your classroom. It might actually make you laugh if you're an actual teacher, because you understand that learning process very rarely happens in a single moment. There is a growth process that has to happen for ideas to begin to settle in and find grounding in the mind of the learner. If that's the case in our own human relationships with parents and teachers, how much more will we expect that to be the case with God? Maybe there are moments where God wants us to understand. He wants to explain to us, and we haven't gotten to the mature point to where we could understand. Now, again, I realize this may not fully satisfy us. But God is saying, you're going to have to trust me sometimes. You're not going to understand it all. But that's not the only explanation. In fact, the Bible is actually pretty clear why there is physical suffering in the world. Why is there natural disaster? Go to Genesis chapter 3 if you have your Bible. Genesis chapter 3 and pick up in verse 17. Genesis chapter 1, God creates the universe and the world. He puts mankind in the garden, tells them to tend the garden. In chapter 3, mankind is tempted and falls to the first sin. And following that sin, there is a curse that comes. Pick up in verse 17. We'll just look at part of that curse. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. There's several parts of this. We're just going to highlight a couple of these. He says the ground is going to be cursed because of sin. That there's going to be a change that is happening. That part of the change is that the ground is now going to produce thorns and thistles. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but thorns and thistles were actually not part of the original creation. In the original creation, there was no death, there was no corruption, nothing decayed or died, people or otherwise. And yet, because of sin, now comes this curse, and now things that cause pain, and thistles actually often cause death. They will wrap themselves around other trees and plants and choke the life out of them. This is a result of sin. Work itself became harder. The ground apparently used to be easier to work. It used to produce more fruit and more vegetables. And here God says the work's going to be harder because this is the result of sin. In fact, if you look in chapter 2 and look at verses 5 and 6, it'll describe how, in verse 5, that now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Instead, but a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. I grew up in the South, and especially sometimes in the late spring and summer, if you were about to have a rainstorm, or if it had rained, especially, if there's a lot of moisture in the air, you'd wake up and the grass would be soaked. If you walked out there in your tennis shoes, you'd come back and your tennis shoes would be soaking wet just from all the dew that was on the grass. Apparently, that was the way God used to water the earth. He used to summon a mist, summon the dew out of the ground, and it would water the earth, as it does still in some places in the world. But it hadn't rained. In fact, the first time it rains, apparently, is in chapter 6 of Genesis. At least that's the first time we're told it's going to rain. And it rains because God is sending a cataclysmic flood to punish the wickedness of mankind. And in Genesis chapter 6, the world is described as being so wicked that every thought of man was on evil continually. And only Noah and his family apparently were trying to do what's right at all. That's a terrifying picture, that all of your neighbors, all of their thoughts are evil. They're thinking about how to take advantage of you, how to trick you, how to steal from you, maybe how to kill you and take your stuff. This is a terrible place. And the very first storm that brings a cataclysmic flood happens because of sin. And so the short answer to all of this, why is there corruption? Why is there decay in the world? Why is there pain and suffering? The short answer is sin. It exists because of sin. But this is not just an Old Testament answer to that question. Go to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, pick up in verse 18 with me. Paul's writing this letter, and he talks about some of these ideas of death and corruption and how it affects the physical world and universe. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. Pause right there. That God took creation, which didn't commit any moral sin. Planets and stars aren't moral beings. They didn't choose to sin. And yet God took those things, and he took the animals and the plant life, and he subjected them to the same futility. Why does he say futility there? Because life that ends in death is pointless. If there was no hope of a resurrection, if there was no hope of life continuing, then there ultimately is no point. If there is no God out there in the universe, there is no point to anything. Thus, subjection to death and corruption, or pain and suffering, which ultimately leads to death and corruption, is the same thing as subjecting something to futility, pointlessness, meaninglessness. He specifically mentions that creation is also subjected to the suffering of pain of childbirth. We didn't read that section of the curse, but that's part of the curse. In Genesis chapter 3, God says there's going to be pain in childbirth because of sin. That apparently that was not part of the original creation. If there had never been sin, we would not have that pain. And having a daughter and looking forward to having another daughter, that's something that is very real to me. Having seen that as my wife suffers in childbirth. Now this might seem cruel to us. Why would God add this to the consequences of sin? Why would God make the physical creation suffer consequences, especially when the physical creation isn't responsible? It's humanity, it's mankind that chose the sin. The animals and the plants and the stars, they didn't make that choice. But then why would God make our situation worse? Well, I have a serious question for you, and it's not intended to be a pun there. Really, it's a serious question. But consider this. Without serious suffering, how serious would we be about God? I'm sure you can think of a real-life example where you've seen a parent, or you've seen a teacher, or you've seen a police officer, metaphorically trying to shake some sense into some kid. They're trying to make the kid realize you are in serious trouble. If you keep going down the path you're on, it is going to destroy you. That is apparently what God has done with the physical universe. Again, if our life was pretty much okay, if there are very little problems, oh, maybe I stubbed a toe here, maybe I got a cut there, maybe I broke an arm. But if that was the extent of the suffering, would we be challenged with the question or the thought that something is wrong with the world? Something is missing. Something isn't right. I don't think so. We might be inconvenienced, but we would not think that there was an actual serious problem, that there was a disease. That's what physical pain and suffering makes us realize. That there is a disease, and that disease is sin. So God subjects the physical creation that leads to all kinds of pain and suffering to make us realize we are in serious trouble. Again, that answer doesn't necessarily satisfy us. Again, it actually might make us a little bit angry. So if those are the answers, how in the world do we cope with the reality of pain and suffering? Well, the first thought, which I think deals a little bit with the emotional struggle we face, is to realize God's not immune to that suffering. It's very easy. In fact, often I think it's implicit in the accusation that God can't be all good and all powerful and let pain and suffering, evil and suffering exist in the world. I think there's often an implicit assumption that that doesn't affect God. But consider Hosea chapter 11, where it's in the context where God is saying throughout the book, I have to punish sin. I'm a just, fair God. I can't ignore wrongdoing. And for context, this is a nation, talking about the Israelites, this is a nation that has stolen property from widows and orphans, that is sacrificing babies on altars, that is doing some terrible things. And yet, in 11 verse 8, look at what he says. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. Verse 9 goes on to talk about the fact that he doesn't want to execute his justice. He doesn't want to execute his righteous anger because he cares about people. When mankind sins against God and against each other, it pains God. It's not like God sits there and watches the suffering of the world and says, whatever. No. It's affecting him on an emotional level like it affects people. And I would dare say on a much more significant level because he is aware of all people across time and all the things they go through. I could not imagine that kind of suffering. But it's not just that. How do we cope with this reality? I think one of the helpful realizations is that God's ultimate sacrifice, and there's several things we could talk about with this, but God wanted to give people hope. He wanted people to realize there is something more than the death that is confined to the universe. There's something more than the meaninglessness of physical existence ending in death. But for that to be possible, he had to pay a price. John 3:16, one of the most famous verses in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. I include verse 35 to make this point. The Father loves the Son. God has to have his own Son be killed at the hands of the very ones he's trying to save so that he could overturn the consequences of sin that started back in Genesis chapter 3. So that people could have hope for life after this world, so that they could be with God. And we won't take the time to consider the suffering and pain that Jesus, the Son of God, goes through, experiences, so you and I could have hope, so that we would have a chance to be with God. But you cannot look at those stories and say God doesn't care. God is immune. That God doesn't love the world. Go back to Romans 8. Look back again at verse 18. Paul, who writes this, is the perfect ambassador to write this. Paul is an apostle. And we meet Paul as an anti-Christian. He is not just persecuting Christians, he is actively trying to get them arrested and killed. The first time we meet him, he is watching a Christian get stoned to death. And God eventually calls him to be a Christian, to calls him to follow and spread the good news of the gospel. And from that point on, Paul becomes a sufferer. He's run out of town after town after town. He's stoned and left for dead. He's beaten on multiple occasions. He's imprisoned unfairly on multiple occasions. He goes hungry. He's left out in the cold. He is lied about and mistreated and betrayed by people he trusted. Paul knows suffering. And so when Paul writes verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Paul says, look, suffering, it's real. It's a struggle. But when I compare what I've gone through to where we're going, Paul says it doesn't compare. If you think about a moment in your childhood where you didn't get something, or you were betrayed by a friend, and you just felt like your world was falling apart, I'm sure you can think of something that was huge in that moment, and now you look back and you realize that's not as big as it felt in that moment. It is not as difficult. It was real. It was a struggle. Notice Paul doesn't say the struggle isn't real. He doesn't say that the pain isn't real, or he doesn't say it's not a big deal. What he does say is that in comparison to the glory to come, it doesn't compare. And that is the ultimate coping mechanism to the suffering in the world. God offers hope. Pick up with me down in verse 23. "And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it." Paul talks about that promise of resurrection for those who are in Christ. He talks about the hope that is found in being in Jesus and being with God one day. He says that hope of glory. But there are stipulations God has. There is a path that has to be followed for us to accept that gift, to open up the package and enjoy the hope and glory that comes with that. And if you have questions about that, feel free to contact us and we'd be glad to talk more about that. But Paul says this is the ultimate coping mechanism. God has paved the way for a glorious hope. Let's give one more analogy before we wrap up this lesson. If you meet a couple who has a godly 50-year plus marriage, every single couple is going to tell you there are moments where they wanted to quit. There was suffering. There were hurt feelings. There was miscommunication. There were trials. There was loss. It was hard. But if you asked every single one of those godly couples if it was worth it, they would say yes. I say godly marriage because any marriage that becomes what God wants it to be is worth the suffering that led up to it. And that's an analogy. In fact, Ephesians chapter 5, marriage is an analogy for our coming relationship with God. That glorious hope that Paul talked about in Romans 8. And in fact, there are certain things about the marriage and that experience that cannot be accomplished without going through the hard stuff. And so while these answers may not be as satisfying as we might want, I do hope that they give you some hope that I can trust and that you can trust God as we wrestle with this reality. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact us via Facebook, and we would be glad to discuss those with you. May God bless you